Hello, and welcome to Sorry Is This Boring? I'm Marika.
I'm Natalie.
Today we're finally doing the culmination of our Pride Month Teenage Apocalypse series.
The third and final installment.
So the third and final film in Gregor Aki's Teenage Apocalypse series is titled Nowhere, which came out in 1997.
It's 10:37 p.m. I've got a belly full of pesto.
And you're ready? Hey presto. Sipping on that box shard.
Marika's got a ice cold glass of boxed wine.
So, this film came out in 1997, but it was in production for 2 years. It started in 1995, the year I was born, which was the highlight of the year. And it's written and directed, of course, by Gregor Aki. Art directed by Dan Knapp and Par White. Costume design by Sarah Slotnick.
1995 is also the year that I died.
That's really crazy.
Yeah.
It's also the year that Jerry Garcia died.
Whoa.
So, what happened?
Jerry Garcia's soul left his body and entered yours.
Yes. It stars, of course, James Duval, our main man. It also
Everyone's boyfriend, James Duval.
Yep. It also stars Rachel True, who plays Mel, most famously from The Craft. It stars Kathleen Robertson, who plays Lucifer, who most famously is from 90210. And it has cameos from many a star. Some of the fun cameos in this film, well, actually, a fun fact is that every adult character in the movie is played by a known actor from a sitcom or comedy from the 70s and 80s.
That's really interesting.
So, Dark's mom is played by Beverly D'Angelo, who's from the Vacation movies. The fortune teller is played by Charlotte Rae from The Facts of Life. Bart's parents are played by Christopher Knight and Eve Plum from The Brady Bunch. The televangelist is played by John Ritter, who's from Three's Company. The newscaster, Lauren Tews, is from The Love Boat. And Egg and Ducky's father is played by David Leisure from Empty Nest.
That's so interesting.
I thought that was a really cool fact to learn, because obviously I didn't pick up on all of these people, because I'm not familiar with 70s and 80s sitcoms and comedies.
American.
Yeah, especially American ones. So, but knowing it is really cool.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely ties into.
And it's such a deliberate choice too.
Yeah. There's also familiar faces in it, like Christina Applegate, Heather Graham, Rose McGowan does a cameo, Shannon Doherty from 90210 as well. The film Nowhere, Gregor Aki has said it's 90210 on acid, which I believe was also the slogan on the VHS release on the front. And the best way to describe this film, I have a quote or a blurb taken straight from the back of the VHS cassette tape box, which was released in the late 1990s. It says, Nowhere is the final chapter in the acclaimed director Gregor Aki's, in parentheses, The Doom Generation, The Living End, stunning and thought-provoking Teen Apocalypse Trilogy. Nowhere follows a day in the life of Dark, played by James Duval, an 18-year-old trying to weave his way through the psychedelic, drug-addicted, sex-crazed world that is life in LA. Along the way, he encounters dozens of angst-ridden characters played by some of pop culture's most recognized stars, including Shannon Doherty, Christine Applegate, Tracy Lords, John Ritter, Kathleen Robertson, and many more. But at its core, Nowhere is an overtly sexual, achingly real story about a sensitive kid struggling with a quest for eternal love in a fractured world. That is a beautiful blurb, and I feel like with the viewing of this film, it really does cement the idea that at the heart of all of these films is just somebody who's looking for love purely, usually played by James Duval, in this crazy chaotic world of LA in the 90s. I feel like a good way to start it off is I have I was reading articles about the film, and there was this one with this kid who bought the VHS, or he rented it from Video World or something. He was like had the flu. This was like 1990s. He was 15 years old. He had the flu, and he gave his mom a list of films to rent for him from like Video World, and one of them was Nowhere. And he wrote about it. He said, "Being 15, I of course sweated over the normal question teenagers asked in bad poetry. Was I gay, straight, bi? Did I matter? Was I meant for this world? Was my existence and everyone's a cosmic mistake? God's accidental sneeze after the Big Bang had kicked up the dust? Was I wearing the right clothes or Nikes that year? Was there a meaning to life other than wasting time at video stores and arcades?" But as I watched Nowhere the first night, all these childish worries evaporated. My sexuality dissolved, my gender dissolved, life became easier after Nowhere. I soon joined up with a gaggle of pseudo-punks and started migrating to Chicago for ska shows at the Fireside Bowl. On weekends, I wandered around museums and random city blocks wherever I could become anonymous for a few hours, wherever I might bump into that person who, despite all our petty knowledge and shitty apparel, might look beneath the surface. And I feel like that was like a beautiful retelling of watching the film for the first time. Because even though like this film is like the least talked about of all of the trilogy, I feel like like all the accounts of people who love it just like were so taken by it. Like it really did change them. So
Yeah, and I feel like, I mean, with my personal experience and also reading things online, I feel like how the film is taken is really, really polarizing. Like, I read things of people just being like, oh, I went to go see this in theaters, and I was like, what the fuck is this horrible film? But I feel like for people who this film is made for, it has like made a huge impact on them, and it made a huge impact on me.
yeah.
You know?
So this film was shot on 35 millimeter, of course. But honestly, it was near impossible to find information about the production of this film. And in fact, it was near impossible to find a version of this film online. It is like not on any streaming platforms. There's like some illegal versions that freeze up and you can't watch. So we had to download it illegally.
Yeah, torrent that shit.
There is no DVD's version of it released in America, I believe, which I've heard is due to issues with the music used in the film, making it too expensive for a DVD, like, Region 1 release. And so there is, like, a UK DVD release, like, with a director's commentary that came out, like a limited edition kind of thing. But I don't imagine that there's lots of copies. Which is, like, really unfortunate. And it made me think, like, maybe that's, like, something to do with, like, the other films aren't that easy to find either. And I imagine if it's, like, related to the fact that, like music copyright, it's, like, too expensive to do it now. And, like, no one's financing it.
I was reading stuff about alternative comics recently, and stuff with, like, stuff with LGBT themes and things like that. And I was reading this quote from someone I really can't remember, which I guess is terrible, but they were just talking about how, you know, growing up in Kansas, you know, middle of nowhere America, and feeling like the things that they needed from media weren't really available to them.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that really interesting, and I feel like it really relates to, you know, this whole trilogy. We've had a really hard time finding online or even finding DVDs. There's usually just one copy on Amazon that's like over $100, which is just totally inaccessible.
Yeah.
And it's really sad that these things that, you know, need to reach people are so unavailable.
Yeah.
And it feels almost conspiratory.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah, I actually have a quote from Greg Araki. He was like, it was in an interview from like 2019 because of the Starz show Now Apocalypse, his like most recent work. He was interviewed. He's sort of been interviewed a lot about it, sort of retrospectively within the hype of that show. But in this interview, he was asked about queer cinema. And he was asked, like, what does he think about queer cinema now? And, like, this current state of queer cinema. And he basically said, like, I don't know what you consider that. He said, is Bohemian Rhapsody queer cinema? And he says, like, to me, new queer cinema was like The Living End, Swoon Poison, all the stuff that came out in 1991 to 1994. It was like a very specific moment in time relating to ACT UP and the AIDS crisis. And there's a handful of 5 or 6 filmmakers who were making movies about that. And it was a very specific thing that happened in culture. He says, to me, that is the queer cinema. Having gay characters in movies like Will and Grace isn't queer cinema. And he was saying how it's like great representation, but there is like, it's so hard to define. There's like not really a lot of like really big queer cinema movements like new queer cinema was as a movement, which is unfortunate. And there just like needs to be more.
Yeah. That got me thinking about, so it's really interesting that he was talking about that, because I was reading something about temporality in relation to queer theory and queer media, and they were talking about how linear storylines, this also relates to, I believe, it might be that Deep Les essay. In the straight world, in the world of heteronormativity, people have set paths, and it's sort of laid out for you by your parents who are also heteronormative, and so you're kind of already put on this path where you're gonna go through school, and then you're gonna get married, and you're gonna have children that look like you, and then those children are gonna be on that same path. And when you're queer, you kind of grow up adjacent to that. You don't really have this set path that's laid out for you. And that same concept kind of falls into queer media, or just media in general. So there's kind of this idea of heterotemporality, where a story follows this sort of linear timeline, and the characters will, find love or get married or things like that. But for queer people, that was the big important thing about new queer cinema, is that it didn't follow this heteronormative timeline, and everything about it, like the core of these films felt queer in how you experienced them.
Yeah.
And I think I understand what he means by how things with queer characters in them aren't queer cinema, because it's just putting queer characters into that heteronormative temporality. What was it? Like Will and Grace? Or yeah, there's queer characters in it, but it's just a regular sitcom. It follows the same formula that everything else does. And that's what's so amazing about these films that he made, is because it doesn't feel like he's just inserting queer characters into, films that have already been made. It feels like something completely different, completely adjacent, and really connects with how queer people feel so outside of these things.
Yeah, and like one thing interesting, like he was talking about in this interview, was how like he was saying like in 1992, like when these films were coming out at Sundance, like people's like jaws were on the floor, like it was like outrageous. It was like really provocative. And then like post, like Will and Grace and Brokeback Mountain, he was saying how like this is like the same vision of those early films that I'm making with now Apocalypse, the TV show. But he said, but it's like a TV show on Stars. It's going to be seen around the world, and there's like billboards for it on Sunset Boulevard, And even though it's the same vision as he had in those films that he made in the 90s, but it's just like become accepted. But at the same time, with that, it's sort of like there's like, I guess, like less of a movement about it. And like we talked a lot about this, like queer baiting and stuff in shows, and I feel like it makes it harder for like queer, like actually like queer driven projects to be successful and like gain momentum and have movements around them.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I actually did read an article when I was trying to do research about the film. I landed on this article that was about Now Apocalypse, and it was this person talking about how this is the show they just really need at this certain point in time. So I wanted to read it because it was positive, and they were basically saying the the same things that we have where there's so many teen shows right now that are so glossy and seem budgetless in a way. TV is not really trashy anymore, you know, especially with this new age of streaming.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's so much focus on putting out content and people just, like, throwing money at things and making them as glossy and meaningful as possible. And they were saying that even the ones that have gay characters are still sort of feel like these high-end HBO kind of shows.
Yeah.
And what they love about Now Apocalypse is how sort of unapologetically trashy and campy it is.
Yeah.
And it sort of allows you to just turn your brain off and enter this world where people are just unapologetic.
Yeah.
And I think it definitely is different from his old work, but it still holds the same spirit of just feeling so nonsensical, erratic, and just people who are kind of hard to define.
Yeah. I have a quote from a review from the New York Times from 1997 when the film came out. It says, "Visually, Nowhere exudes an inviting pop art glow. As its parade of the beautiful and damned exchange their slurpy kisses, they are photographed in swooning love cosmic close-ups. If it weren't so overpopulated and desperate to shock, Nowhere might have succeeded as a maliciously cheeky satire of Hollywood brats overdosing on the very concept of Hollywood. But the movie is so hectically paced that it doesn't have time to develop its characters or to flesh out the tales it sets in motions. Even comic books are better at telling stories."
Fuck you, New York Times. Maybe I'm just being childish and defensive, but I just kind of feel like people who kind of view it as just schlocky for the sake of being schlocky are just kind of missing the point.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's necessarily that it has a really intense point or theme to it, but it's made for people who films don't get made for.
Yeah, it is true. Like, we don't get loads of time with any of these characters, like, especially comparatively to the other films. But at the same time, like, it is a trilogy. It's like the finale of this trilogy, you know? And I feel like it feels, like, quite true to, like, the point of the film. Just, like, it gets you closer to James Duvall's character because he's just, like, the one constant, and you know, that's what, like, the whole trilogy is about. Like, whether James Duvall's playing, like, Andy or Jordan or Dark, it's like somebody looking for love desperately in, like, a crazy mad community or, like, society.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really think you're supposed to really get to know and understand the other characters.
Yeah, and it sort of feels, like, quite true to, like, my experience of just, like, you know, like, living in New York, like, in my 20s, like, you know, going to college there, and it's just, like, there's, like, crazy characters that are just, like, in and out and around you all the time, and it's sort of so fleeting.
Yeah.
A lot. And there's, like, a few people that stick.
Okay, so let's break this shit down. So, the beginning of the film starts out, well, there's the title sequence, where the title and the credits kind of just drift into and out of the screen, and it looks very, like, old digital effects, like things that you would find that are just come with your editing software, which I do love about it.
It reminds me of, like, the DVD, like, screensaver, where it's like, bloop,
yeah,
bloop.
right before it blacks out, when the DVD is just
Floating
bouncing
around. Yeah.
off the edges. Yeah. And I think right before then is the quote from Dark where he says, LA is like nowhere, everybody who lives here is lost, and it's kind of on this screen, this blue screen that's flickering that feels like right when you turn on an old TV and it's just that blue light.
Yeah, actually, like, I like several different people, like compared like some of the elements of like the film to different artists. And Namjoon Paik is one of the people that was mentioned in a couple of different articles I read. He used to do a lot of stuff with interrupting TV broadcasts.
I mean, it definitely feels like this crazy subversion of television of the time.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah, especially with all of the actors.
Yeah, exactly.
On TV in it. Acting absurdly.
And even TV sets and things on the TV.
Yeah.
Constantly within the film. So the very first scene is James Duval in the shower, and it sort of pans down from this white space into a shower that he's in, which I found to be just really interesting right off the bat, because it puts you in this sort of unreal space.
Yeah.
Right from the beginning. It's like this infinite shower, you know, in this infinite white space.
Yeah, or like in his headspace or something.
Yeah. And so I think that really starts it right off the bat of the film being very subjective. And I also love all of the images that play in his head to masturbate to.
Yeah, it's like the boy in the locker room is like, and it's like really like loving, you know, and then there's like the two female dominatrixes, and then there's like Mel and like the red satin bed.
Yeah. And I really like the wide range, and that also right off the bat kind of starts you off with this idea that nothing is concrete.
Mm-hmm.
That, you know, sexuality within the film is going to be very hard to define.
Yeah. And then his mom bangs on the door and is like, "Are you in there flogging the puppy again?" She like says she has to rot her life away in a 9-to-5 shithole to support him.
And also, when she's yelling at him, there's those crazy jump cuts. Yeah. And I feel like we also talked about previously that he was really heavily inspired by French New Wave.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that's, whenever I think of jump cuts, I always think of French New Wave.
Yeah.
And so I thought that was, I think it's something that is, happens a lot within this film.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah. And the next scene, like, I feel like throughout this film, like all of his films, there's like this like crazy symbolism. And the next scene is like James Duval standing in his bedroom, and he's wearing like an American flag towel around his waist.
Mm-hmm.
And the wall in his room is like this huge mural of a boy who looks like exactly like James Duval, like holding a gun to his temple.
Holding two guns to both of his temples.
And he's just like standing there. It's just like this huge wide.
Something that we just talked about after we watched it was that I was saying that I feel like his films don't necessarily culminate to me, but they all bleed into each other.
Yeah.
Like, I don't believe that Nowhere is a culmination of all of his films previously, and then, you know, his film after that is a culmination of those, but they all just sort of bleed into each other. And that just definitely felt very Doom Generation to me.
Mm-hmm.
I think anything where it's sort of subversion of Americana is very Doom Generation.
Yeah, and there is, you know, like lots of in this film. For example, when, I don't remember the character's name, but he's like, it's at the party, and it's, one of the twins, like the female twin man she's with, like beats that guy with the, Campbell's tomato soup can. Like, just till he's, like, bloody.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, like, the most overt, like, pop symbolism.
Yeah.
The next, like, scene is, like, he calls up Mal's girlfriend on the phone, and, she's in this twister, wearing, like, twister overalls.
Yeah.
Which is really funny. And I read that that's, like, a nod to this artist, who I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, called Yayoi Kasuma's, and, like, she had a series called The Dots Obsession.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I don't know if that's, like, that was their intention, but
I feel like I could totally see that.
yeah. Another really cool piece of art direction in the film, which I loved, was when you see Bart for the first time in his, or I don't know if it's the first time, but you see him in his bedroom, and there's like this big white wall with these like words all over it.
I think the whole sort of dynamic between the triad is really interesting.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because, like, one thing that James Duvall's character Dark says, which I feel like sums it up, is he says, like, sometimes I feel so old fashioned, like, from another planet, but it's like I'm half a person without you, which he says to Mel. Like, the whole way throughout, he's kind of like, why can't we just be the two of us? And she's like, you know, I just like want to love as many people as I can. And I feel like, you know, even though you don't really get the insight into Lucifer's head that much, it's like quite clear that she's more in line with Dark's way of thinking, because obviously she like is quite hostile towards him, but then there's the party scene when she starts hooking up with these like two twins, and Lucifer goes over and she's like really upset, and Mel's just like kind of like laughing because she's like drunk. She's like, what? Why are you upset? And she just like continues to hook up with them, which is just like kind of awful to watch. And then
I think it's very interesting, both of their perspectives, because, you know, I'm not really a big believer in monogamy. I think it's something that's definitely super heteronormative and old-fashioned, and, you know, the whole thing kind of started because of property and, like, owning people, and those are just things that I really don't agree with. And I don't think that it's wrong for people to be monogamous. I just don't really like the concept and the history of it. I really like that there's a character, especially a female character, that really doesn't believe in monogamy.
yeah,
Because I think it's something that's really rare, and I don't think it's shown in a really negative light. You know, I don't think she's viewed as like a whore or anything like that. You know, I think her depiction is really positive to me, and it's just the fact that Dark has just differing values.
yeah, and like Lucifer too, clearly.
And I feel like his views also kind of remind me of the whole that film Hedwig and the Angry Inch. There's a concept within the film that's based on Plato's Symposium, and it's this idea that, you know, humans were once these like singular entities that were split into, and so people are just constantly looking for their other half. I've definitely oversimplified and butchered it, but it's sort of vaguely what the concept is. And so I really liked that concept was shown in a queer perspective within Hedwig. And what I'm trying to say is, you know, I kind of talked about how monogamy is something that can be like really heteronormative, but I don't think that these characters that are just searching for love and genuine connection with just one person, I don't believe it makes them heteronormative, you know?
Yeah.
And so I believe that, you know, both of their perspectives are really valid and are also really beautiful. I guess another thing that I felt like bled in to Nowhere from Totally Fucked Up was the sort of meta aspect of making a documentary within this fictional narrative. Seeing cameras and camera footage, editing.
I feel like it's like much less present as a theme, and it's kind of like fizzles out even, you know, like at the beginning he's like filming a lot, and he's like sort of like when he's talking at the cafe, it almost comes off like a little pretentiously filmy. And then there's like the one like video kind of monologue, but then I feel like after that it's sort of like it doesn't appear that much.
But I think it does make sense within the context, because he kind of gets swept up. So I guess after the exposition is sort of when the idea of impending doom begins. Dark and Mel and Lucifer go to the cafe, and they bring along Montgomery, which was the boy who was in Dark's masturbatory fantasy in the very beginning.
Yeah.
And that one girl comes up to him in the cafe, and she's like, comes up to Montgomery and is like, do you know what today is? And he's like, what? And then she's like, some people say that like this date marks the beginning of Armageddon.
Yeah.
And it's like this whole sort of very Christian take on the end of the world. You know, she's a really religious character. And, you know, clearly it's the Teenage Apocalypse Trilogy, and this is the last one, so the idea of the apocalypse is something that is very culminating. You know, it's a really present theme. It's kind of played out in from a lot of different perspectives, and in a lot of different ways. There's, you know, spirituality and religion, you know, there's death, there's premonitions.
Yeah. I feel like that is like the turning point in the film, because like after then, he sees the lizard when he's like at the bus stop, and it's like Rose McGowan and Shannon Doherty and this like the Valley girls are just like gossiping, and then they get evaporated. It's just their retainers left behind. He like tries to film it, but he misses it, and it gets sort of darker in theme from there. Like the scene right after that, we see like Bart for the first time, like he's like, you know, overdosed.
And even before then, before the first alien encounter, when they're talking about the classes that they're taking in college, it's one of them is thermonuclear catastrophe and the other one is lethal epidemics.
Yeah.
And so it's just everything surrounding them is just like impending doom.
Yeah.
And there's also the palm reading that one really hypersexual straight couple gets. Mm-hmm. That's about death.
And then there's like, after that there's like a TV report about space aliens, and we see the televangelist on the TV. You know, there's like we see Montgomery at the bus stop for the first time, and he's like by this bus bench which says like, God's help me.
Yeah.
There's like one scene, it's like one of the characters, what she says, have you ever wondered like if the big earthquake hit all the power plants in LA blew up? She's like, what would they do with all the bodies?
Yeah.
Which is kind of like weird to think about now, because like we're in a pandemic and there's just like surpluses of dead bodies. I mean, I remember like seeing photos of New York that are just like having huge like crates of trucks out back of hospitals just like filled with bodies because there was too many to fit in the morgue.
It's horrifying.
Yeah, and they like had to do like they had to make mass graves.
Yeah. Yeah, it is definitely interesting watching this film during a pandemic. Yeah. And clearly we've talked about this before, so much of his work, especially at this time, is informed by the AIDS epidemic.
Yeah.
During times when there's disease and a lot of people are dying, it really does kind of feel like the world is ending.
Yeah. There's like obviously a lot of like, one thing that I kind of loved is like how kind of comical the suicide scenes are.
Oh yeah.
Because like there's like two like quite graphic ones. Like we see Bart and he's like his head is in the oven, and the shot is just like his body like hanging out of the oven, and his parents are just like screaming in some kind of, you know, not German language.
Yeah.
And then the next one is with Egg. She's like in her like little, you know, pink bedroom with the flowers, and there's just like so much blood like splattered all over the walls, and her dad is like on the phone again just like screaming.
Yeah. And I almost feel like, you know, especially because we've talked about, you know, the idea of Greg Araki taking so many things and so many people from sitcoms and soaps, that I feel like, especially with teen dramas, there's so much of those kinds of things, you know, it's all surrounding sex and drugs and death, and everything's so over the top. And so I feel like those kinds of things might have been sort of a commentary on that in a way. It's, you know, because it is his sort of version of 90210, you know, in a way, his fucked up version of it, and so feels like it has to pedal to the metal.
Yeah. So the one thing I was thinking about that was like so similar to Now Apocalypse, because it was interesting to like watch this film again since I've seen the TV show, is that both films have like this like queer romance that like involves like mutual alien experiences. Like one of them gets abducted, and one of them, and it's like this cosmic like magical connection that feels like so destined and fated, and that's like something that's in both of those works, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, I actually wanted to talk about that sort of from like I guess like a personal perspective, because especially with using this character that James Duval plays a lot, that's just sort of looking for love and is really like sad and hopeless, and I feel like in this film and in his other films, these protagonists kind of feel like they don't fit in with the straight world, but they also don't fit in with the queer community.
Mm-hmm.
And I personally have felt like an outsider all my life, but I still feel like I haven't really been accepted into the queer community. I feel like whenever I find, I guess, a romantic partner, it does feel really cosmic. Being young and living in the city, and I think what our own experiences mirror his films is just the idea that it seems like everybody's just fucking all the time, you know?
And you're just like looking for someone to hang out with you.
Yeah, exactly. You know, I'm just looking for friendship, and, you know, everybody's so concerned with getting laid all the time. That's what I love about his perspectives, his protagonist perspectives in these films is, you know, it's not about the trials and tribulations of getting laid in LA. It's just about feeling like such an outsider in every which way, and then just trying to find someone, and sometimes finding someone, and it feels so magical to have that connection.
Yeah. I have a quote from Iraqi. He said, "There's really an element in everyday life in LA of the surreal and unexpected and the strange mixing in with the ordinary and the mundane. You can see aliens walking down the street and you just don't really blink." That's not necessarily indifference, but a kind of tolerance. Los Angeles is so big and sprawling that there's really kind of a laissez-faire attitude towards people. It's not a big deal that someone's gay or straight or bisexual or has purple hair or is black or Asian. Everybody just sort of does their thing, and people don't really pay that much attention to you. And it's one thing that I really appreciate about living there. And I feel like it's like the idea of like one like role that like, you know, like the extraterrestrial plays. It's just like the idea of like everyone just like not really paying attention because they're so wrapped up in themselves or whatever that's going on. Like same with New York, like you can just like, you know, nobody gives a shit like what you're doing at any time of day, which is like kind of lonely until you like meet someone that like saw what you saw or like sees you, you know?
Yeah, totally. I remember this one time where it was when Marika and I were making a short film for one of my classes for my final project, and we basically were reenacting scenes, famous murder and death scenes from old horror movies, anywhere between like the 50s and the 80s. I remember walking back to my apartment after filming a scene with my friend Noah, and he pretended to slash my throat on camera, and so I was just walking back covered from the neck down in fake blood, and nobody batted an eye. You know, it was something that I was so waiting to walk back, and people being like, "Are you okay?" And then I remembered, oh, I'm in New York. People really don't give a shit and are not concerned with anyone else but what they're doing in that moment. And it is something that was kind of like strange and concerning, but also totally liberating.
Yeah.
And I think that concept is something that is definitely, I think it's definitely really introduced in Nowhere, but it's definitely explored a lot more in Now Apocalypse, is the idea that Ulysses, the main character, he is so lonely in the way that he is having these sort of strange alien experiences and premonitions, and nobody just seems to give a shit at all because they're all wrapped up with their own lives.
Yeah.
When you were talking about the New York Times quote, and they were saying that you don't get really enough time with any of the characters, but I did feel like there were certain moments when, the camera is just held on certain characters where it's almost like little video portraits, where I felt like you actually did get a lot of insight into them.
Yeah.
And I feel like it was something so simple, but just, their faces, their emotions and reactions were so telling.
Yeah, I feel like that's like the other thing that we like, like with other films, is that they are very photographic feeling in the way that they're filmed, because like they tell so much with so little. It's like the smallest moments, like the stills from it, just like tell so much.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like you almost don't really need a lot of time with characters because he can really say a lot with a shot. I thought it was funny when Mel's little brother goes to that convenience store to talk on the payphone, and above it says time to buy and consume. And that was very Doom Generation to me. He put so much effort into making the world of his films feel so outside of our own. It's kind of what I talked about in the Doom Generation podcast when I talked about the idea of hyperreality.
Yeah.
I think that's something that really bleeds into this film.
Yeah, and like he like thinks of his films as like very surrealist and dreamlike, and like I feel like that comes across so much with the art direction, because there's like all these recognizable things that are just like slightly more like exaggerated or like perverted.
Yeah. I mean, I guess another thing I wanted to talk about was the design of the alien. I mean, something I love about it, which is actually when I was reading the article about Now Apocalypse, and the alien is pretty much the same. I mean, maybe I'd have to look at them side by side, but I kind of remember them being pretty much the same exact costume. And they were saying that it was almost akin to a mascot. And I thought that was a really funny comparison. But I think there's something that I love about just how in your face it is. Clearly, it's a costume. It's not high practical effects. It's not high computer effects. It's this big reptilian alien costume that somebody's wearing. And there's also no tricks of light. There's not a lot of shadows when the alien is seen, and there's not a lot of camera angles to obscure anything. So it's just really just the costume. But the film is set up in such a way where you just believe it, you know? Yeah. There wasn't any point when I was watching the film and I was like, oh, like, this is a human in an alien costume. This is ridiculous, because the whole film is so surreal that the introduction of this alien isn't really something to throw you out of it at all. I think my disbelief is still suspended as I see it on screen.
Yeah.
And I kind of wonder what the experience would be of watching Now Apocalypse without having seen this film, because I feel like then watching Now Apocalypse, I also didn't bat an eye at the alien.
Yeah.
But I wonder if it would have been really jarring.
Yeah.
I guess we should talk about the ending.
Yeah, the ending. I actually have a quote. It says, "Nowhere, featuring gratuitous sex, disturbing violence, drug use, and a bleak ending that would make Kafka come in his pants."
Honestly, that's my new life goal, is to have someone quote my work as saying it would make Kafka come in his pants.
Yeah. And, obviously Montgomery explodes into a huge insect.
I mean, prior to that, it's one of the sweetest fucking moments I've ever seen in a film.
But I love it. I like the way it ends a lot.
Mm-hmm.
It's good.
Yeah, I mean, I'm all for humans exploding as an alien breaks free from their insides. And the fact that he just goes, I'm out of here.
Yeah.
Then crawls out the window, and that's literally the last line of the film.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I just feel like it's punk rock.
Yeah. Yeah, and, like, that's, like, one thing that Greg Rockby, like, says is, like, just, like, how much punk rock, like, influenced him. And, you know, he even said that, like, in an interview, he, like, talked about, like, people are so shocked when they actually talk to me because they think from my movies I live this crazy life, like taking a lot of drugs and going to sex parties. But he said, but I've never had a death wish. I've always been very interested in alternative culture and rebellious, different outside the mainstream things. But I've never viewed myself as being self-destructive. I don't take drugs. I barely drink. A lot of people who are really driven to drink or like alcohol or drugs or whatever, they're trying to escape, he thinks. And so he's, like, always been, like, fascinated by it, but, like, kind of an outsider to it, I guess, which I thought was, like, really interesting. I feel, like, relatable, because I definitely, like, make art about things that I'm a bit outside of.
Oh, totally. I feel that. Yeah, I feel like I've never fully subscribed to anything, and I think it's sort of partly because there's just too many interesting things that how could you subscribe to one, and I think it's also partly because I just don't feel like I belong in any of them. I don't think I've ever felt really welcomed in any of them.
Yeah. And, like, James Duval in his film, this trilogy, like, kind of play, like, the outsider to the outsiders, you know? Which
totally.
I feel like is, like, a very, like, much more relatable perspective than...
Yeah, and I feel like that's why I feel like his films are made for me, you know? I feel like that's why his films are definitely misunderstood a lot of the times, but I feel like when they are, it has a really powerful impact on people.
Yeah.
I guess something that was kind of racking my brain was, I just felt like the presence of the alien was a metaphor that I didn't really fully understand. And I also know that queerness and science fiction can a lot of times go really hand in hand, and I feel like his depiction of it is something that is really different, but it does make sense to me in the way of adding aliens to a queer work.
Yeah.
To be honest, I'm going to be reading a lot of stuff from Wikipedia. But I found this article that was about LGBT themes and speculative fiction, and I found it to be really interesting, and I think it adds stuff to it. So there's a little bit of history of science fiction, and before the 1960s, explicit sexuality of any time was rare in speculative fiction, as was most fiction, as the editors who controlled what was published attempted to protect their perceived key market of adolescent male readers. So basically, people just assumed that science fiction was just for young men. There clearly wasn't much room for exploring sexualities if, you know, your target audience is straight young men. And also, even sexuality in general was kind of condemned in a way, as it is kind of in horror, you know. There's the whole trope that sex equals death.
Yeah.
And usually homosexuals, if they were in there, were villains, you know, which is also just common in most works of fiction in the past. Something that really helped initiate change was the civil rights movement and the emergence of counterculture. So then there was new wave and feminist science fiction. These authors realized cultures in which homosexuality, bisexuality, and a variety of gender models were the norm, and in which sympathetic depictions of alternative sexuality were commonplace. So it was more about, you know, creating futures where things were not heteronormative, not patriarchal. From the 1980s onward, homosexuality gained much wider mainstream acceptance and was often incorporated into otherwise conventional speculative fiction stories, Works emerged that went beyond simple representation of homosexuality to explorations of specific issues relevant to the LGBT community. In speculative fiction, extrapolation allows writers to focus not on the way things are or were, as non-genre literature does, but on the way things could be different. This provides science fiction with a quality that science fiction critic Darko Suvin has called cognitive estrangement, which is the recognition that what we are reading is not the world as we know it, but a world whose differences force us to reconsider our own with an outsider's perspective. And I think, the idea of reconsidering your own cultural assumptions is something that, a queer film really benefits from, and, what science fiction can really benefit from in a queer perspective. A lot of it is about alternate realities or imagined futures, and when you have the perspective of a minority, when you feel like the world is against you, science fiction and fantasy too especially, it gives you this power to imagine things in a different way. And I think that, something we've definitely talked about with Gregoraki's films is the idea that he's kind of a part of Generation X, which is sort of stereotyped as this nihilistic generation, which I don't believe is wholly a negative stereotype. I think it's almost more of a problem for people to believe that, a nihilistic generation is a problem.
Yeah.
But I think because his films tend to be very nihilistic and tend to adopt that perspective a lot, for him to tackle sci-fi during this time means that it's not really about imagined futures, but, it's more about things imploding.
Yeah.
And something I was talking about with the idea of temporality within his films, and how it informs new queer cinema. And I think especially because of not only with the AIDS crisis happening at that time, but the idea of queer people not aligning with the timeline that's in place for everybody else. It sort of adds to this idea of being outside of a timeline just kind of means death. And I thought that was kind of an interesting concept. And so I think that is also what drives his films.
Yeah.
And especially with Nowhere. But yeah, I guess I just wanted to have like an open conversation with you about what the alien in the film, or aliens, could mean metaphorically.
I think, as I said before, for me, I interpret it as it's just represents the idea of cosmic, bigger picture. It's not necessarily literally what the aliens mean. It's the idea of seeing them and experiencing them, and that being a shared experience with somebody else, or are you alone in it, or is it shared? I feel that relates to the queer experience. And the idea of being an outsider, you feel so alone and crazy, and then somebody has seen the same things you have. So I feel that sort of represents to me.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I feel like affirmations are something that's very important for somebody that definitely feels like an outsider. But yeah, I guess I just think it's really interesting for his inclusion of aliens, or, his creation of a sci-fi story that is still within the context of his previous films. Because, reading a lot about the sort of cross between queer themes and science fiction, a lot of it sort of points to the alien itself as being a metaphor for being queer.
Yeah.
And a lot of times it's, it's about a person falling in love with an alien, And even thinking about one of the most recent things is like The Shape of Water, and that's something that can be read as queer.
Yeah.
Because it's like a relationship that isn't considered normal, and causes a lot of controversy and criticism from the rest of the world. And I think that's something that I really like about his work, is that it's not, even though clearly there's a lot of stuff about love and sex, but I feel like kind of what you were saying with the metaphor of the alien is it's not about a queer relationship being gawked at from the outside world, but it's just about the experience of feeling outside just because of who you are, and not quite about who you're in a relationship with. Because, I think a lot of works that tackle queerness are a lot of times about relationships, and it's about the way people perceive somebody who is in a queer relationship, but it oftentimes doesn't really go into the whole experience of just being queer in general, because it is something that can really inform your being without it just being about who you're in love with at the time or what relationship you're in or about sex. So when I was thinking about just the whole concept of the alien in relation to queerness, it got me thinking about Jonan Vasquez, who is the creator of Invader Zim. I was watching something or reading something, he was being interviewed, and he was talking about how a lot of his characters in his comics and in his show Invader Zim are kind of like bad versions of himself. Like, it's all of the bad or negative qualities he has personified into one singular character. And it kind of just shows him how bad he could be. And also with concepts of storylines, a lot of times they sort of go along that same line. So thinking about Invader Zim, as a child he always wanted to go out into space, and so this sort of concept of space being really terrible is a way for him to sort of get over that dream being crushed in a way. Like, oh, well, I'm never going to make it out into space, so what if space is just terrible and then I'm not missing out on anything? And so I think a lot of the times with queerness, there's, the whole idea of being an outsider and feeling like you don't belong and having the desire to leave the planet, or feeling like maybe there's things out there that might be better. I thought that maybe this was sort of a way of Gregor Rocky to sort of do the same thing, where these aliens come to Earth and they're kind of just terrible and they just zap people and it doesn't matter who they are, or they'll just implant alien bug babies into them and they'll explode.
Mm-hmm. I feel like something that's, like, interesting maybe to think about, like, with that is, like, is there some meaning in, like, who the aliens target within these films,
Mm-hmm.
Because, like, in Apocalypse and in this, like, the sort of survivors, I guess, like, sort of, like, the ones that don't just get zapped, or, like, that we see again, like, Montgomery and then, like, Tyler Posey's character in Apocalypse, and they're sort of like the ones that are like the purists, like the romantics and stuff,
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, like, there's like the Valley Girl that just gets zapped and they disappear. Oh, it makes me think about, like, Mysterious Skin as well. Like, the idea, like, with that one, the aliens and that's Greg Araki, right?
Yeah. But spoilers ahead.
Okay, so spoilers ahead for Mysterious Skin. It's like another one of his films which has, like, really prominent alien themes. But in that film, the aliens are a metaphor explicitly within the film for sexual abuse. So these two young, like, queer boys both experienced. And like, one of them, like, sort of replaces the memory with the memory of this alien abduction. And, but at the same time, there's sort of these two, like, fated young queer boys who find each other, and yeah, it's sort of like the idea. I feel like it is nihilistic in a way, the idea of, like, the bigger picture being just so shitty, yeah, you know.
Yeah.
But obviously, like, the idea of even like a smaller scale of just, like, making things bad, like, it's something that's relatable, and that, like, I feel like it feels like a very adolescent thing to do. Like, I've felt that, like, I've experienced that in my adolescence, of just sort of, like, hating people because I'm not part of it, thinking, like, that it's stupid, like, you're, like, a little bit better than these, like, people that do these things that you're just, like, so excluded from. And I think it's sort of like a coping mechanism as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the thing about the bigger picture kind of reminds me of what we were talking about in relation to, I believe, Totally Fucked Up, was the whole idea of paranoia tied to queerness. And I think sometimes it can provide some sort of ease or understanding for things that are just so much bigger than us and so outside of our control that are really terrible,
Yeah.
And I think the alien can be a metaphor for that as well. It's kind of like a similar concept with It, with Stephen King's It. It's like there's just things in this world that are really horrible, and to have this, like, monster that is behind everything gives this sort of explanation when sometimes there just really isn't anything.
Yeah. And I think, like, as well, like, the idea of, like, being able to see, like, these things, like aliens, like these supernatural things, is kind of like, for me, it relates to, like, the idea of seeing, like, the futility or, like, the stupidity in things people do.
And also seeing people sort of reduce themselves into a really small world perspective.
Yeah.
Just revolving their lives around things that are so futile.
Yeah.
My first question is, what was your favorite shot and favorite scene of Nowhere?
My favorite shot is, I think, of Bart's parents when he, like, comes back home, and they're just, like, dressed in plaid, and it's, like, this plaid wool behind them, and they're, like, watching TV, and they're just, like, speaking to him, like, in some kind of, like, German type language, but it's just, like, nonsense, like.
And they're eating, like, a giant bowl of, like, gummy candy.
And it's just, like, so crazy, and I, like, also loved it. Like, there's the two actors from the Brady Bunch.
Yeah.
And so it just, like, feels like this totally surreal, like, fucked up, like, Hollywood, like, mind fuck. And I just, like, love the art direction of it, and I just love this, like, simple, like, wide of these two characters, and it's, like, just, like, the Hollywood absurdity of it all. Yeah. That's, like, one of my favorite shots from this film. My favorite scene, I love the scene where he, like, sees the lizard for the first time on the street, and he's, like, filming with his camera, and there's, like, the three Valley girls, like, Rose McGowan is one of them, and Shannon Doherty, and they're just, like, gossiping, and then they just get evaporated, and there's, like, just their retainers left behind. I love that scene.
It's so good.
So good. My first question is, like, what was your favorite piece of art direction from this film?
I mean, I feel like everybody's rooms I really loved. I feel like they gave me, like, another sense of hyper-realism in the way where it feels like it's so representative of them. And it's almost like what you wished your room was as a teenager. Just such a representation of you.
Yeah.
And I think one of the memorable ones was the one girl who, she had that mini dress with all of the fabric flowers, the little fabric roses all over it. And she goes into her room and like everything looks like her dress, which is really cool. And that's mirrored in a lot of different things, like we already talked about with Mel, and she's wearing the Twister overalls with the Twister wall in the background. And I also found the coffee shop to be really interesting, or the cafe, because it felt like something that I wish was a real place. And I think a lot of it also goes along with just queering spaces in general. And I feel like there's a lot of places that maybe at one point existed like that, but they just really don't anymore. And so it's cool to see these sort of fantasy versions of city spaces for youth.
Yeah. Yeah, another cool thing is, like, the film actually takes place over the course of one day, which I feel like I didn't really, like, think about while watching it, but, because, like, you know, a lot of the characters, like, change outfits several times, but it is actually the course of one day, and so they're just, like, sort of hopping from, like, place to place, which is cool.
Yeah. So my second question is, we've talked about this multiple times during the course of this podcast, but it's Gregoroki's self-proclaimed 90210 on acid. If you were to make a kind of crazy, campy, queer movie like this, what show would you use to make a crazy acid sci-fi version of?
I would love to do, like, Friends on acid. I feel like that'd be funny because, like, it is, like, a show that, like, I used to watch when I was, like, really young. Just, like, it would be on TV and stuff. And then, like, I remember, like, watching it again, like, as an adult. And, you know, like, in my 20s, I feel like I'm a very different person with very different tastes. And, you know, I'm, like, pretentious art school kid. And I was just, like, appalled by the jokes. They just, like, have aged so poorly. And, like, a lot of them are, like, really sexist or homophobic. And they're just, like, so anti, like, anything normal, or, like, what's considered normal, you know?
Yeah.
And so I feel like it'd be really funny to do sort of, like, you know, like, a whole, like, sort of, you know, lynchy or whatever, like, sitcom kind of, acid take on, like, their lives in, like, New York in, like, the 90s, plus, like, with the element of it being kind of meta, you know?
That sounds really fucking cool, and you should make that.
Yeah.
I would watch it. I think it's funny, too, with Friends, because it is a show that is still, to this day, sort of remembered fondly.
Yeah, it's still, like, you know, like, you see people with Friends t-shirts and stuff like that.
And I'm, like, surprised that it's not under consensus that it has aged poorly.
Yes. And, you know, just, like, the lack of diversity, which is, like...
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and especially it taking place in New York City.
Yeah.
And it's all just straight, white, rich people, like...
Yeah.
But who are pretending that they're just in a shitty apartment.
Yeah, there's, like, one person, like,
Trying to
one
get by.
main character in the show who's, like, not, like, from an upper middle class background, and most of the time when she talks about her backstory, it's, like, as a punchline, you know?
It's so fucked up.
Yeah. And she'll be, like, you know, telling some sad story about her, like, challenging upbringing, like, being homeless and, like, living in New York City. And there'll just be a pause, and someone says, like, anyways, and then it's, like, cue the laughter track.
Oh my god.
And it's, like, really upsetting.
Who allowed this?
Yeah. And there's, like, in the first season, it's, like, Ross, who has, like, his, like, ex-wife, who he has a baby with, is, like, a lesbian. She's, like, come out as a lesbian and has, like, a lesbian, like, life partner. And it's just, like, constant, like, jokes about that, like, as being a punchline, you know?
Jesus.
Okay, my next question is, if you were going to be a character in any of the 3 movies from the trilogy, who would you be? It could be either who you think you're most like, or who you would want to be.
Okay. I feel like I would say I'm probably most, like, dark. from nowhere, but who I would probably say I would want to be Amy from the Doom generation. She has such a quick mouth, and she just doesn't take shit from anyone, and I feel like that's something I really aspire to be, is to just have that confidence to not take shit, you know?
We all wish we were Amy's, but we're all Jordan. Just beta cuck.
We're all just being cucked daily. My last question is, out of the trilogy, which one feels the most personal to your queer experience?
I would say probably Nowhere, because I feel like, it's like obviously similar to the first film, but I feel like it is like much more sort of the people are separate, like with the first film there is like much more a sense of community, like of this group of people, whereas like with Nowhere I think the stories are much more separate in a way, and so I feel like it's like relatable, because like I feel like I don't feel that sense of like like big group of queer friends. I don't have that, but there's like little aspects from each of those stories that I can relate to, and like especially like the idea of just like, I feel like that's really cemented, of just like being sort of an outsider, sometimes feeling like you're in this kind of like, like hedonistic, group of like queer, like cool, like the coolest people are all around you, and you're just like struggling to keep up with like their progressiveness, I guess, or whatever, maybe. I feel like that's like a little bit relatable, and just like keep up with the trends and what's cool.
Just a couple of losers.
Yeah. But yeah, obviously. But I feel like my favorite of the trilogies, which I don't know if that's like kind of different, is the Doom generation, which I feel like is like an obvious favorite for a lot of people, but I just like I love it so much. My last question is, what would you recommend for people to watch next who are big fans of Gregoraki?
I guess I have like I have like a few films, I guess, I might recommend. So I'm trying to think of ones that are actually queer, because I think there's like a lot that have Gregoraki vibes, but I feel like queerness seems like something that would feel more important. I guess there's this one movie, Party Monster, that's it's based off a true story about this club kid, Michael Alec, who kind of started the whole club kid scene in the 90s in New York, but he also ended up murdering someone, and it's kind of like a biopic in a way, but it's exactly what you would want a biopic of a club kid who ended up murdering someone to be. It's super camp, it's kind of pseudo-documentary-esque, it's really over the top, and it has definitely elements of darkness and surrealism. And then also, if you really liked Nowhere, I would recommend the film Antibirth. It came out not that long ago, and it stars Natasha Lyonne, and it's this sort of dark but really funny body horror sci-fi film about this woman that ends up getting pregnant, but she didn't have sex anytime at all recently, and so she thinks it's some sort of weird immaculate conception, but she also is like a huge stoner and just is terrible to her body, and so it kind of culminates in this really bizarre, surreal story that's like super gross and fun. I feel like director-wise, I would maybe say I feel like, honestly, I don't really know that many queer filmmakers, unfortunately. But one that I could think of that we have talked about before is Anna Biller, who made The Love Witch, and I feel like her stuff is really art direction heavy, but in a way that is sort of, it's not like high budget, but it's like made with love.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very do it yourself, and I feel like if you want a sort of films that feel like they're in a universe that was totally made by the director, but from a more feminist perspective, I would definitely recommend her films.
And our podcast about The Love Witch.
Yeah, and if you watch The Love Witch, you should listen to our episode about it. Yeah, yeet.
Yeah, yeet.
Well, if you happen to listen to this trilogy, we thank you.
Yeah.
And hope it made your Pride Month or Pride Year a little bit better.
Yes.
Pride Life.
Yeah. Pride Life.
Pride Afterlife.
Sounds lit. I bet it's really good.
Pride Undead. It's gonna be
Pride
our
of
next
Frankenstein.
horror movie. Pride of Frankenstein.
And the monster both come out as lovers. Gay lovers. Anyways, thank you for listening.
Pride of Chucky.
Okay.
Pride of Reanimator. Should I keep going?
No.